Chapter 17, The Progressive Era, Section 4, Progressivism under Taft. Early in the 20th century, Americans' interest in the preservation of the country's wilderness areas intensified. Writers proclaimed the beauty of the landscape, and new groups like the Girl Scouts gave city children the chance to experience a different environment. The desire for preservation clashed with business interests that favored unrestricted development. Gifford Pinchot, head of the U.S. Forest Service under President Roosevelt, took a middle ground. He believed that wilderness areas could be scientifically managed to yield public enjoyment while allowing private development. And here's a quote from Gifford Pinchot. "The American people have evidently made up their minds that our natural resources must be conserved. That is good, but it settles only half the question. For whose benefit shall they be conserved? For the benefit of the many, or for the use and profit of the few? There is no other question before us that begins to be so important, or that will be so difficult to straddle, as the great question between special interest and equal opportunity, between the privileges of the few and the rights of the many, between government by man for human welfare and government by money for profit." President Roosevelt, a fellow conservationist, favored Pinchot's multi-use land program. However, when he left office in 1909, this approach came under increasing pressure from business people who favored unrestricted commercial development. After winning the election in 1904, Roosevelt pledged not to run for re-election in 1908. He handpicked his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to run against William Jennings Bryan, who had been nominated by the Democrats for the third time. Under the slogan, "Vote for Taft this time, you can vote for Bryan anytime," Taft and the Republicans won an easy victory. As president, Taft pursued a cautiously progressive agenda, seeking to consolidate rather than to expand Roosevelt's reforms. He received little credit for his accomplishments, however. His legal victories, such as busting 90 trusts in a 4-year term, did not bolster his popularity. Indeed, the new president confessed in a letter to Roosevelt that he never felt like the president. "When I am addressed as Mr. President," Taft wrote, "I turn to see whether you are not at my elbow," end quote. The cautious Taft hesitated to use the presidential bully pulpit to arouse public opinion, nor could he subdue troublesome members of his own party. Tariffs and conservation posed his first problems. Taft had campaigned on a platform of lowering tariffs, a staple of the progressive agenda. When the House passed the Payne bill, which lowered rates on imported manufactured goods, the Senate proposed an alternate bill, the Aldrich bill, which made fewer cuts and increased many rates. Amid cries of betrayal from the progressive wing of his party, Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich tariff, a compromise that only moderated the high-level rates of the Aldrich bill. This angered progressives who believed Taft had abandoned progressivism. The president made his difficulties worse by clumsily attempting to defend the tariff, calling it, quote, "the best tariff bill the Republican Party ever passed," end quote. Next, Taft angered conservationists by appointing as his Secretary of the Interior Richard A. Bollinger, a wealthy lawyer from Seattle. Bollinger, who disapproved of conservationist controls on Western lands, removed 1 million acres of forest and mining lands from the reserved list and returned it to the public domain. When a Department of the Interior official was fired for protesting Bollinger's actions, the fired worker published a muckraking article against Bollinger in Collier's Weekly magazine. Pinchot added his voice. In congressional testimony, he accused Bollinger of letting commercial interests exploit the natural resources that rightfully belong to the public. President Taft sided with Bollinger and fired Pinchot from the U.S. Forest Service. Taft's cautious nature made it impossible for him to hold together the two wings of the Republican Party, progressives who sought change and conservatives who did not. The Republican Party began to fragment. Republican conservatives and progressives split over Taft's support of the political boss Joseph Cannon, House Speaker from Illinois, a rough-talking, tobacco-chewing politician. Uncle Joe, as he was called, often disregarded seniority in filling committee slots. As chairman of the House Rules Committee, which decides what bills Congress considers, Cannon often weakened or ignored progressive bills. Reform-minded Republicans decided that their only alternative was to strip Cannon of his power. With the help of Democrats, they succeeded in March 1910 with a resolution that called for the entire House to elect committee on rules and excluded the Speaker from membership in the committee. By the midterm elections of 1910, however, the Republican Party was in shambles, with the progressives on one side and the old guard on the other. Voters voiced concern over the rising cost of living, which they blamed on the Payne-Aldrich tariff. They also believed Taft to be against conservatism. When the Republicans lost the election, the Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 18 years. After leaving office, Roosevelt headed to Africa to shoot big game. He returned in 1910 to a hero's welcome and responded with a rousing speech proposing, quote, a new nationalism, end quote, under which the federal government would exert its power for the welfare of the people. By 1912, Roosevelt had decided to run for a third term as president. The primary election showed that Republicans wanted Roosevelt, but Taft had the advantage of being the incumbent, that is, the holder of the office. At the Republican convention in June 1912, Taft's supporters maneuvered to replace Roosevelt delegates with Taft delegates in a number of delegations. Republican progressives refused to vote and formed a new third party, the Progressive Party. They nominated Roosevelt for president. The Progressive Party became known as the Bull Moose Party after Roosevelt's boast that he was, quote, as strong as a bull moose, end quote. The party's platform called for the direct election of senators and the adoption in all states of the initiative referendum and recall. It also advocated woman suffrage, workmen's compensation, an 8-hour workday, minimum wage for women, a federal law against child labor, and a federal trade commission to regulate business. The split in the Republican ranks handed the Democrats their first real chance at the White House since the election of Grover Cleveland in 1892. In the 1912 presidential election, they put forward as their candidate a reform governor of New Jersey named Woodrow Wilson. Under Governor Woodrow Wilson's leadership, the previously conservative New Jersey legislature had passed a host of reform measures. Now, as the Democratic presidential nominee, Wilson endorsed a progressive platform called the New Freedom. It demanded even stronger antitrust legislation, banking reform, and reduced tariffs. The split between Taft and Roosevelt, former Republican allies, turned nasty during the fall campaign. Taft labeled Roosevelt a, quote, a dangerous egotist, while Roosevelt branded Taft a fathead with the brain of a guinea pig. Wilson distanced himself, quietly gloating, quote, don't interfere when your enemy is destroying himself, end quote. The election offered voters several choices: Wilson's New Freedom, Taft's conservatism, Roosevelt's progressivism, or the Socialist Party policies of Eugene V. Debs. Both Roosevelt and Wilson supported a stronger government role in economic affairs, but differed over strategies. Roosevelt supported government action to supervise big business, but did not oppose all business monopolies, while Debs called for an end to capitalism. Wilson supported small business and free market competition and characterized all business monopolies as evil. In a speech, Wilson explained why he felt that all business monopolies were a threat. This is from Woodrow Wilson, quote, if the government is to tell big businessmen how to run their business, then don't you see that big businessmen have to get closer to the government even than they are now? Don't you see that they must capture the government in order not to be restrained too much by it? I don't care how benevolent the master is going to be. I will not live under a master. That is not what America was created for. America was created in order that every man should have the same chance as every other man to exercise mastery over his own fortunes, end quote. Although Wilson captured only 42% of the popular vote, he won an overwhelming electoral victory and a Democratic majority in Congress. As a third-party candidate, Roosevelt defeated Taft in both popular and electoral votes, but Reform claimed the real victory, with more than 75% of the vote going to the Reform candidates, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Debs. In victory, Wilson could claim a mandate to break up trusts and to expand the government's role in social reform. Chapter 17, The Progressive Era. Section 5, Wilson's New Freedom. On March 3, 1913, the day of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, 5,000 women suffragettes suffragists marched through hostile crowds in Washington, D.C. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, the parade organizers, were members of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. As police failed to restrain the rowdy gathering and congressmen demanded an investigation, Paul and Burns could see the momentum building for suffrage. By the time Wilson began his campaign for a second term in 1916, the NAWSA's president, Carrie Chapman Catt, saw victory on the horizon. Catt expressed her optimism in a letter to her friend Maud Wood Park. And this is a quote from Carrie Chapman Catt. Quote, I do feel keenly that the turn of the road has come. I really believe that we might pull off a campaign which would mean the vote within the next 6 years if we could secure a board of officers who would have sufficient momentum, confidence, and working power in them. Come, my dear Mrs. Park, gird on your armor once more. End quote. Catt called an emergency suffrage convention in September 1916 and invited President Wilson, who cautiously supported suffrage. He told the convention, quote, there has been a force behind you that will be triumphant and for which you can afford to wait, end quote. They did have to wait, but within 4 years, the passage of the suffrage amendment became the capstone of the progressive movement. Like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson claimed progressive ideals, but he had a different idea for the federal government. He believed in attacking large concentrations of power to give greater freedom to average citizens. The prejudices of his Southern background, however, prevented him from using federal power to fight off attacks directed at the civil rights of African Americans. Wilson spent his youth in the South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. The son, grandson, and nephew of a Presbyterian minister, he received a strict upbringing. Before entering politics, Wilson worked as a lawyer, a history professor, and later as president of Princeton University. In 1910, Wilson became the governor of New Jersey. As governor, he supported progressive legislation programs such as direct primary, workers' compensation, and the regulation of public utilities and railroads. As America's newly elected president, Wilson moved to enact his program, the, quote, New Freedom, end quote, and planned his attack on what he called the triple wall of privilege, the trusts, tariffs, and high finance. Without the watchful, resolute interference of the government, Wilson said, there can be no fair play between individuals and such powerful institutions as the trusts. Freedom today is something more than being let alone, end quote. During Wilson's administration, Congress enacted 2 key antitrust measures. The first, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, sought to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The Clayton Act prohibited corporations from acquiring the stock of another if doing so would create a monopoly. If a company violated the law, its officers could be prosecuted. The Clayton Act also specified that labor unions and farm organizations not only had a right to exist, but also would no longer be subject to antitrust laws. Therefore, strikes, peaceful picketing, boycotts, and the collection of strike benefits became legal. In addition, injunctions against strikers were prohibited unless the strikers threatened damage that could not be remedied. Samuel Gompers, president of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, saw great value to workers in the Clayton Act. He called it a Magna Carta for labor, referring to the English document signed in 1215, in which the English king recognized that he was bound by the law and that the law granted rights to his subjects. The second major antitrust measure, the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914, set up the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. This watchdog agency was given the power to investigate possible violations of regulatory statutes, to require periodic reports from corporations, and to put an end to a number of unfair business practices. Under Wilson, the FTC administered almost 400 cease and desist orders to companies engaged in illegal activities. In an effort to curb the power of big business, Wilson worked to lower tariff rates, knowing that supporters of big business hadn't allowed such a reduction under Taft. Wilson lobbied hard in 1913 for the Underwood Act, which would substantially reduce tariff rates for the first time since the Civil War. He summoned Congress to a special session to plead his case, and established a precedent of delivering the State of the Union message in person. Businesses lobbied too, looking to block tariff reductions. When manufacturing lobbyists, people hired by manufacturers to present their case to government officials, descended on the Capitol to urge senators to vote no, passage seemed unlikely. Wilson denounced the lobbyists and urged voters to monitor their senators' votes. Because of the new president's use of the bully pulpit, the Senate voted to cut tariff rates even more deeply than the House had done. With lower tariff rates, the federal government had to replace the revenue that tariffs had previously supplied. Ratified in 1913, the 16th Amendment legalized a federal income tax which provided revenue by taxing individual earnings and corporate profits. Under this graduated tax, larger incomes were taxed at higher rates than smaller incomes. The tax began with a modest tax on family incomes over $4,000 and ranged from 1% to a maximum of 6% on incomes over $500,000. Initially, few congressmen realized the potential of the income tax, but by 1917, the government was receiving more money on the income tax than it had ever gained from tariffs. Today, income taxes on corporations and individuals represent the federal government's main source of revenue. Next, Wilson turned his attention to financial reform. The nation needed a way to strengthen the ways in which banks were run, as well as a way to quickly adjust the amount of money in circulation. Both credit availability and money supply had to keep pace with the economy. Wilson's solution was to establish a decentralized private banking system under federal control. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 divided the nation into 12 districts and established a regional central bank in each district. These bankers' banks then served the other banks within the district. The Federal Reserve banks could issue new paper currency in emergency situations, and member banks could use the new currency to make loans to their customers. Federal Reserve banks could transfer funds to member banks in trouble, saving the banks from closing and protecting customers' savings. By 1923, roughly 70% of the nation's banking resources were part of the Federal Reserve System. One of Wilson's most enduring achievements, this system still serves as the basis of the nation's banking system. While Wilson pushed hard for reform of trusts, tariffs, and banking, determined women intensified their push for the vote. The educated, native-born, middle-class woman who had been active in progressive movements had grown increasingly impatient about not being allowed to vote. As in 1910, women had federal voting rights only in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Washington, and Idaho. Determined suffragists pushed on, however. They finally saw success come within reach as a result of three developments: the increased activism of local groups, the use of bold new strategies to build enthusiasm for the movement, and the rebirth of the national movement called the Carey-Chapman Cat, under Carey-Chapman Cat. The suffrage movement was given new strength by growing numbers of college-educated women. Two Massachusetts organizations, the Boston Equal Suffrage Association for Good Government and the College Equal Suffrage League, used door-to-door campaigns to reach potential supporters. Founded by Radcliffe graduate Maud Wood Park, the Boston group spread the message of suffrage to poor and working-class women. Members also took trolley tours, where at each stop crowds would gather to watch the unusual sight of a woman speaking in public. Many wealthy young women who visited Europe as part of their education became involved in the suffrage movement in Britain. Led by Emmeline Pankhurst, British suffragists used increasingly bold tactics, such as heckling government officials to advance their cause. Inspired by their activism, American women returned to the United States armed with similar approaches in their own campaigns for suffrage. Susan B. Anthony's successor as president of the NAWSA was Carey-Chapman Catt, who served from 1900 to 1904 and resumed the presidency in 1915. When Catt returned to NASA after organizing New York's Women's Suffrage Party, she concentrated on 5 tactics. 1. Painstaking organization. 2. Close ties between local, state, and national workers. 3. Establishing a wide base of support. 4. Cautious lobbying. And 5. Gracious, ladylike behavior. Although suffragists saw victories, the greater number of failures led some suffragists to try some radical tactics. Lucy Burns and Alice Paul formed their own more radical organization, the Congressional Union, and its successor, the National Woman's Party. They pressured the federal government to pass suffrage amendment, and by 1917, Paul had organized her followers to mount a round-the-clock picket line around the White House. Some of the picketers were arrested, jailed, and even force-fed when they attempted a hunger strike. These efforts and Americans' involvement in World War I finally made suffrage inevitable. Patriotic American women who headed committees, knitted socks for soldiers, and sold Liberty Bonds now claimed their overdue reward for supporting the war effort. In 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. The amendment won final ratification in August 1920, 72 years after women had first convened and demanded the vote at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Despite Wilson's economic and political reforms, he disappointed progressives who favored social reform. In particular, on racial matters, Wilson appeased conservative Southern Democratic voters, but disappointed his Northern white and black supporters. He placed segregationists in charge of federal agencies, thereby expanding racial segregation in the federal government, the military, and Washington, D.C. Like Roosevelt and Taft, Wilson retreated on civil rights once in office. During the presidential campaign of 1912, he won the support of the NAACP's black intellectuals and white liberals by promising to treat blacks equally and to speak out against lynching. As president, however, Wilson opposed federal anti-lynching legislation, arguing that these crimes fell under state jurisdiction. In addition, the Capitol and the federal offices in Washington, D.C., which had been desegregated during Reconstruction, resumed the practice of segregation shortly after Wilson's election. Wilson appointed to his cabinet fellow white Southerners who extended segregation. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, for example, proposed at a cabinet meeting to do away with common drinking fountains and towels in his department. According to an entry in Daniels' diary, President Wilson agreed because he had, quote, made no promises in particular to Negroes, except to do them justice, end quote. Segregated facilities, in the president's mind, were just. African Americans and their liberal white supporters in the NAACP felt betrayed. Oswald Garrison Villard, a grandson of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, wrote to Wilson in dismay, quote, the colored men who voted and worked for you in the belief that their status as American citizens was safe in your hands are deeply cast down. Wilson's response, that he had acted, quote, in the interest of the Negroes and, quote, with the approval of some of the most influential Negroes I know, end quote, only widened the rift between the president and some of his former supporters. On November 12, 1914, the president's reception of an African American delegation brought the confrontation to a bitter climax. William Monroe Trotter, editor-in-chief of The Guardian, an African-American Boston newspaper, led the delegation. Trotter complained that African Americans from 38 states had asked the president to reverse the segregation of government employees, but that segregation had since increased. Trotter then commented on Wilson's inaction. And this is a personal voice from William Monroe Trotter. Quote, only 2 years ago, you were heralded as perhaps the second Lincoln, and now the Afro-American leaders who supported you are hounded as false leaders and traitors to their race. As equal citizens and by virtue of your public promises, we are entitled at your hands to freedom from discrimination, restriction, imputation, and insult in government employ. Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens? God forbid, end quote. Wilson found Trotter's tone infuriating. After an angry Trotter shook his finger at the president to emphasize a point, the furious Wilson demanded that the delegation leave. Wilson's refusal to extend civil rights to African Americans pointed to the limits of progressivism under his administration. America's involvement in the war raging in Europe would soon reveal other weaknesses. After taking office in 1913, Wilson had said, quote, there's no chance of progress and reform in an administration in which war plays the principal part, end quote. Yet he found that the outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914 demanded America's involvement. Meanwhile, distracted Americans and their legislators allowed reform efforts to stall. As the pacifist and reformer Jane Addams mournfully reflected, quote, "The spirit of fighting burns away all those impulses which foster the will to justice," end quote. International conflict was destined to be part of Wilson's presidency. During the early years of his administration, Wilson had dealt with issues of imperialism that had roots in the late 19th century. However, World War I dominated most of his second term as president. The progressive era had come to an end.